And I'm really gratified and excited to welcome back Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. Rabbi Tuchman is a rabbi and educator based in the Washington, D.C. area. And she has taught for La Asok before as part of our social justice in our text series. And I'm really thrilled to welcome her back to teach us again. Before we start, let's say the blessing for study together. So I'm going to share my screen. If you would like to unmute so that we can hear one another, if you feel comfortable unmuting so we can hear one another, I would invite you to do so now. If you'd rather stay muted, that is also fine. And we'll say together, Baruch atah
Baruch
Adonai,
atah Adonai,
Eloheinu melech
Eloheinu melech
haolam,
haolam,
asher
asher
kidshanu
kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok divrei Torah.
Blessed is the Eternal, whose mitzvot make our lives holy, and who commands us to immerse, to engage in words of Torah. I'm dropping into the chat a link to the text that Rabbi Tuchman will be teaching from today, and I'm going to turn things over right away to Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. Take it away.
Thank you so much. It is a delight and an honor to be here today. I want to say a couple of things by way of how we're going to proceed this afternoon. One of which is that I think it's really important as a teacher of Torah to arrive to any shiur as authentically as I can. And so I want to let you know that I live as Rabbi Stryfer just said, right outside of Washington, D.C., but I actually spent the last week on a meditation retreat just outside of Los Angeles. So you can imagine that that was quite the experience, especially as somebody who is not local to that area. And so I'm really grappling with that in lots of different ways. And that's very present for me in my experience. And so the text that I'm going to be offering today is one that I really turn to in moments like this. And it may not feel hopeful on its face, but I want to argue that I find it to be actually an incredibly hopeful text. And the way we're going to do this is because I really want to hear from all of you. I am actually going to teach it a little bit orally, meaning that you have the link to the sources. There is some historical context in there. There is the actual text in there. You can have that at your leisure and you can have that open on your own screen and you can be looking at it. But I'm going to be teaching a little bit more what we call in some spaces outside, meaning that I'm going to be giving over the ikar, the main ideas of the text for the purposes of our learning today, and then we can really delve into some questions that may arise. So I wanted to begin in that way, and I want to start out by just saying a couple of very brief words about the text that we're going to be looking at today. It's from a beautiful collection of Divrei Torah called the Eish Kodesh, written by the Piaseczna Rebbe, Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, who was known primarily as the Warsaw Ghetto Rabbi, but actually has a significantly deeper biography than that. He was known as the Children's Rebbe because he loved education and really cared about education. He deeply believed in practicing Judaism in a very spiritually oriented way. There are very few extant, as I understand from my teachers, there are very few extant examples of his Jewish mindfulness practice, but we know he had one. We know he had a really deep meditation practice, and we know he really cared a lot about creating spiritual community. Lots of the work that we have from him was found, I believe, in 1946 by Polish construction workers in Warsaw who found the Oneg Shabbos archive. The Oneg Shabbos archive was a significant compilation of texts that were buried under the Warsaw Ghetto, and Piaseczna included his works there. And Baruch Hashem, thank God, he has really become a teacher whose work continues to impact many people around the world today. And that is an incredible blessing. Now, the compilation that we're going to be looking at is called the Eish Kodesh, also known as the Holy Fire. Sometimes people refer to the Piaseczna as the Eish Kodesh. This was a series of sermons that he delivered between the years of 1939 and 1942 in the ghetto. But there's There is growing scholarly consensus, and I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that there is growing scholarly consensus that Piaseczna edited the texts of the sermons after delivering them in through the early months of 1943. The last text we have is from the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av in 1942. And unlike a lot of Hasidic rabbis who would actually not write their own teachings, they usually were delivered on Shabbat afternoon, and in their communities, people would not write on Shabbat. So students would, as soon as Shabbat was over, they would run home and write down what the Rebbe taught. Usually that's what happens with most Hasidic texts. In our case, as I understand it, the Piaseczna actually did write these sermons himself. Whether they were written post facto after he taught them orally, I'm not clear on that. I can learn more about that from my teachers, but that's my understanding of kind of where this book came to be. So the text that I'm going to be kind of teaching for the next few minutes is for Parashat Chayei Sarah, which this is one of the very first texts in Eish Kodesh. It's from 1939. And the thing to know, there are two really important pieces to know historically, and there's more information in the text that you have. The first thing is that the Piaseczna lost multiple relatives in the bombing of Warsaw before this drash, and he actually was silent for several weeks prior. So bearing in mind that just after, I believe it was the second day of Sukkot, that the Warsaw Ghetto was that Warsaw was bombed, and he lost numerous relatives in that horrible, horrible disaster. And he went silent for a couple of weeks. Chayei Sarah is the fifth parsha of the year. So we read it a couple of weeks ago in our own Torah cycle. And one of the things that often comes up when we read Parashat Chayei Sarah is that the title, the rabbis gave the parshiot, the rabbis divided the Torah, as many of you may know, into 54 parshiot or portions. And they gave each portion of Torah a name that was based on the first significant words of the parsha. So Chayei Sarah literally means the life of Sarah. But the irony that gets pointed out over and over again is that Sarah dies in that parasha, in the first verse. And the rabbis talk a lot about, why is it, particularly this is something that comes up in Rashi's commentary. Rashi is the preeminent for many for many people who are in the rabbinic tradition, they would say that Rashi is the preeminent sage of the medieval period. His commentary is still, particularly in more traditional communities, it's still really referenced. Those of us who are not as ensconced in a particularly traditional pedagogic approach, like Rashi is still a very important commentator, but may not be the most important commentator. Be that as it may, for the Piaseczna, the Rashi was very important, and Rashi references the fact that you have the Torah describing Sarah's life in three distinct stages: 20 years, 100 years, and 7 years. And Rashi asks, why? So the Piaseczna in his teaching picks up on this opening verse. And often what happens in Hasidic texts is that there will be a verse from the Parsha, but then it's taken in a variety of different approaches. And so, as I said, we're not going to delve into the nitty gritty of this text today. It's very powerful. I'm going to give over, as I understand it, the main parts of it, and you should feel free to follow along, ask any questions. I'm aware of our time, so I'm going to try to be as efficient as we can be. So, bearing in mind that the Piaseczna Rebbe has just lost several family members in a horrible tragedy, and he's been silent for several weeks now. So he asks the question, and he really roots it in Rashi's commentary, and he roots it in the commentary of his great great grandfather. He came from a very esteemed Hasidic lineage. He really asks about why. Why is it that we have a juxtaposition between the near sacrifice of Isaac and Sarah's death? What's going on here? Why is the Torah why does this happen? Now, the Piaseczna assumes we might, in this space, we might say, well, was there an editorial process, whatever it is? Piaseczna assumes that, as Rashi says, Ein mukdam u'muchar l'Torah. There is no beginning or ending in Torah. Um, and so because of that, and forgive me, I'm going to turn this phone off. I apologize for this interruption. Um, because Rashi believes, as do many traditional commentators, that there is no beginning or end in Torah, um, the question can be asked about the repetition or about the juxtaposition rather between Isaac's near sacrifice, which happens the chapter before, and Sarah's death. What's going on there? So the Piaseczna rooting his answer in some commentary based on his great great grandfather and based on Rashi is really, excuse me, is really asking the question, why does this matter? What's going on? Why does Sarah die so quickly? And he talks about the ways in which sometimes the human being is so overwhelmed by the experiences that they're going through in their lives. They just can't take it anymore. And this is a part of the text that gets a little bit complicated, and I want to just really walk us through it slowly. The notion of the human being so overwhelmed that their soul flies out of their body. The notion of Sarah was so shocked and appalled by the fact that she almost lost her son to a sacrifice, that she just couldn't take it and her soul flew from her. The Piaseczna then takes that idea to say, sometimes it is just too much, and Sarah made a choice to cry out to God and say, I cannot do this anymore. Her soul flew from her. If Sarah Imenu, if Sarah, our mother, can make the choice to just cry out and say, I can't do this anymore. I just can't do this anymore. Well, then all the more so. All the more so do we have the ability to be in that kind of dialogue with Hashem. Sometimes we just, and again, this is my outside framing of the teaching of the Piaseczna. Sometimes we just can't do it anymore. It's too much. There's too much happening. And in those moments where there's just too much happening and we can't understand what's going on, we sometimes are just trying to send a message of like, God, it's too much. I can't do it anymore. Now, some people have asked, is the message of this drash effectively that Sarah took her own life as a means of making a statement? Now, that is extraordinarily complicated, and I don't think that we're going to go there today. I don't believe that that is what the Piaseczna ultimately is intending to say. I actually like to think of it in a different way, which is to say through her death, that action was extraordinary and was emblematic of the grief that she was having. This is my understanding of what the Piaseczna is arguing here. And that therefore it's a cry from the depth of despair. It's a cry to say, like, I can't do this anymore. And it's a reminder that we get to, that again, this is me channeling what I understand the Piaseczna to be saying. We get to be able to just, we don't have to just sit there and take it. We don't have to try to find explanations for everything that happens in our lives that went really badly. There's not a silver lining. There's often not a silver lining. So what can we do? We can actually cry out and we can say, no, we're not doing this. This is too much. Can't handle this. This is unjust. I cannot believe that my husband nearly sacrificed my son. For what reason now? The son that I've been praying for decades and decades and decades, only to then have that son be sacrificed? And I think what the Piaseczna is encouraging his followers to say is we don't have to just, we go through our lives, and for those of us who, again, the Piaseczna is a very traditionally observant person with a very particular theology. That theology is very likely not going to land with any of us in this space or most of us in this space. But if we're with him in his theology right now, he's basically, as I understand it, saying we don't have to just accept like this is the way of the world, things are going to happen, it's really hard and really scary and sad, but like this is the way it is. Actually, we get to protest, we get to cry out, we get to say no, this is too much, this is unjust, this is wrong, this is not okay, right? And now I'm going to step out a little bit and speak as Rabbi Lauren Tuchman and say there's something really incredibly hopeful to me in the way in which the Piaseczna in this teaching about Sarah really is with his people. And he's basically saying, like, he's coming from the perspective of saying our ancestors were righteous, right? We have a dugma, an example in our ancestors. We can emulate them. Sarah was a righteous person. That's the place that we're coming from right now, right? And if somebody as righteous as Sarah is broken and her soul is shattered, well, then of course, so are we. The circumstances that the Piaseczna was in were totally unimaginable. And something that I have really experienced in a deep way over the last week is the felt sense of understanding that Baruch Hashem, though I was not physically impacted by the fires, and I am extraordinarily grateful, and my heart and soul are with everybody in this room who has been, everybody who may be watching this later. Please know that I'm with you. Even still, being in such close proximity, it shifts how we think about and understand disaster and calamity. When I studied the Piaseczna before this past week, right, I would often think, oh, yeah, wow, he was in the ghetto and it was horrible. And we knew about how bad the conditions were, right? That's not a secret. We knew that the conditions in the ghetto were really difficult. And I knew on a deep level that I could not understand how difficult they were. And at the same time, there was a bit of a remove. It's like, yeah, that was really hard. Wow. And he was still able to be with his people. Wow. And he was still able to teach this Torah. Wow. And now it's like, oh yeah, proximity. And he talks about this very deliberately in the last Rasha in Eish Kodesh for Shabbat Chazon, where he talks about, we used to lament on Tisha B'Av for the destruction of the temple. And again, we're talking about somebody in a very traditional perspective. We used to lament for the destruction of the temple. We used to cry. We used to learn all these things. But that is very, very different from undergoing the kind of trauma we're undergoing right now. And I think in some ways there's actually a lot of hope. And here's where I want to end and then open it up. Why I find this so hopeful, which may feel really paradoxical because we're doing a class called Tikva through text, is that the PSS is saying a couple things here. First of all, you're not alone. That's one of the biggest messages I think he's giving over to his people. You're not alone. I've been silent now for 6 weeks. Why? Because I lost my family. I'm devastated. This is like me imagining. He's not going to say this directly in his drash. He doesn't reference the historical events in his drashot at all, which is very interesting. But I am with you. I'm in pain too. And if our righteous mother Sarah can be in that much pain and can say, I just can't take it, Hashem, like I just can't do it anymore, well, then of course, how can we expect ourselves to keep going in moments like this? We get to cry out. We get to feel. This is something that Piaseczna really talks a lot about in B'nai Machshava Tova, which is a book for adults interested in creating spiritual community. He has a couple of books for children as well. But he talks about, sometimes we have something arise in our neshama. We have a feeling in our soul, I'm a little uncomfortable. Something's going on for me that I don't know what's going on here. So I'm gonna find something external to distract myself. I'm gonna have a drink. I'm gonna have a snack. I'm gonna take a nap. in our parlance, I'm going to pick up my phone. I'm going to turn on the news. I'm going to go on to social media because I don't want to actually sit with what's here. I want to distract myself. And so the Piaseczna really invites people to open up to the fullness of their experience. And that I think is something that's going on in this drasha. He doesn't say so directly, but opening up to the fullness of our experience, crying out, knowing we're not alone. And that's how we keep moving forward, right? That's the hope of moving forward at times of deep despair is knowing we're not alone, knowing that there are people around us who get it. And even those who don't, like just being able to know that we're here. And I think that that is really important in what the Piaseczna was able to offer through this rather stark teaching. So I want to pause. I know we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to just invite any responses. And the way we'll do that is that people can raise their hands. And please keep your responses concise and to the topic of this presentation. And I want to hear as many of them as I can. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. This has been so wonderful so far. There's a couple of comments in the chat, and if it's okay, I have a quick comment to share first, and then
Please.
if others would like to raise their hand, please go ahead. I was just comparing what you were teaching with I think it's either Rashi or the Midrash with regard to the commandment about Amalek, where it says, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you. Amalek is, of course, the nation that sort of fights against the Israelites in the wilderness. And the commentators point out that the word Zachor doesn't only mean remember, it means to speak aloud, to say aloud. And some of the point there is that speaking aloud is actually the way that we enter into supportive community. So I wonder here also if, the uh, the Piaseczner in some ways is saying it's okay to cry out, because sometimes it's okay to just feel despair, but also crying out is the way that we connect with others who are also suffering at the same time. So that was my
Exactly.
thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. That's exactly for me where the hope is in this text, right? Is that the Piaseczna is saying, Zachor, speak aloud your pain, right? Speak aloud your pain with others in a way that can be heard. Because that's, as you said, that is exactly how we enter into supportive community. And I often think about how often many of us, for any number of reasons, think like that's not okay. We can't do that. I'm sure everyone in this room can come up with 20 reasons why I can't do that, right? What's going to happen if I open up? I know for me, sometimes my mind tells me if I open up to the pain, then the world's going to end, right? Like, oh my God, I have to keep everything together. And especially as a rabbi, like often the idea of like, I have to keep it all together because other people need me, right? And if there's anything I've learned over the many, 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 I mean, I'll be sitting with this experience for a very long time. If there's anything I've learned over the last week, we all need that supportive community, whether we are teaching a space, whether we are participating in a space. And I think being able to really speak that aloud is precisely what the Piazetzin is doing, even though he doesn't. I mean, I imagine that people in his community knew. Of course, they knew he lost his family, right? So now he's able to frame it in Torah terms that can be heard by the community in a particular context as a way of helping him enter into that space. He often talks about also being b'machaneh hashchina, in the camp of the Shekhinah. And how do we remain in the camp of the Shekhinah, right? How do we not take ourselves out of the camp of the divine presence? And I think that also, to your point, is exactly it. I think that's coming up here too.
Hmm. So do you want me to read a couple of the comments in the
Yes,
chat?
please.
Okay, so let's see. Susan says, do we know that Sarah knows she almost lost Isaac, or does she think he's dead because he didn't return with Abraham? At least we don't think he did. And she says, either way, what a horrible feeling. I'll just read a couple. Bruce, I think you spoke to this a little bit already, but Bruce asks, how do we find hope in the midst of such feelings? Sabrina has quoted for us from Psalm 131, where it says, "Do we just rest in God? I have calmed and quieted myself. I am like a weaned child with its mother." And then Vicky says, "I need people who do get it. Others who don't can be destructive, at least for me. It's knowing others understand my pain. If I speak aloud, I want to be heard." So I think Vicky's speaking to there to the issue of safety, right? How do we know that it's safe
Absolutely.
to speak aloud? And then I can't read everything here, but Alfred says that speaking aloud can lead to what can I do or what can we do? So in the 3 minutes we have left, I don't know if you want to respond to any of that.
Yeah, I'm going to particularly respond to Vicky. Um, For sure. I mean, and this is always, the delicate dance. And I'm figuring, every time we go through something difficult in our lives, right? Figuring out, who is it that we're going to speak to about it and thinking about safety personally, emotionally, physically. And, it's such a contrast, right? When you're around, if you've gone through something and then you're around people who haven't, right? Piaseczna is in a situation where everyone is undergoing calamity that we are still, I mean, forgive me that this is not going to sound very hopeful, but I actually deeply believe that on a cellular level, we as the Jewish people are still navigating the after effect of the Shoah. And so, if we're thinking about that this text was written before the Shoah began, but really, really when things were getting bad in 1939, the Piasetzna is around people who get it because they're going through calamity. And so, too, um, for us, when we think about, we don't, right, I hear what you're saying about if you have somebody who doesn't get it, that can be really destructive in a deep way because that can sometimes that can add to like you might feel like, oh, this person doesn't get it. Now I need to take care of them. So part of the work that I find is really helpful is calming my mind and asking, is this person, do they need my care or are they expressing themselves the best way they know how to? Or can I let them do that without them jumping in and feeling like I need to care or fix or whatever the case is? That is often much easier said than done. And I guess I'll say also, wise discernment and skillful means are really helpful. We're not going to share with everyone in our lives the pains that we've been through, which is hard, right? Because we have to make the discernment around who can really get it, and who is not going to get it as well. And that's tricky and difficult. And so I just want to encourage us to think about that skillfully and to think about who are the people that I really trust, who are those that I really trust that I can be with in that vulnerability? Who has to, who is close to me in that way? And, how can I give myself permission to make that discernment? And how I'll end here with that beautiful line from Psalm 131, like, right, how do we rest in that awareness? How do we rest in that calm, knowing that that's here? Some of us may find that really comforting, some of us really may not. Whatever it is that we can rest in, whether it's the divine, other people, the universe, nature, wherever you find that comfort, trying to find a sense of stability. Like, and when I say stability, I mean physically feeling your feet on the floor, right? Physically feeling your body in the chair, thinking about what is around you right now. How do I remember and tell my body that things are here? All of those things I think are really important. And I think that if the Piaseczna were alive today, those were things that certainly would be incorporated into this teaching.
Well, let me say thank you to Rabbi Tuchman for this really moving teaching. We packed a lot into the last 28 minutes or so. I'll just draw our attention to one more note in the chat, which is from Sabrina, who talks about as a fellow New Orleanian, I'm also from New Orleans, how the experience of Hurricane Katrina, she says, opened my heart to understanding disasters that came before and after. So I wonder if having been through difficult times then makes us particularly equipped to support others in difficult times. And so maybe in that sense, we Jews, as we do continue to struggle with generations of trauma following the Shoah, it also perhaps makes us equipped to support others who go through various kinds of really difficult experiences in the world. So I'm deeply grateful to Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. I dropped in the chat earlier a couple of links of hers, her website, as well as her Substack. She has teachings there on a regular basis. Divrei Torah, I'm subscribed to her material. She has Divrei Torah that you can listen to or watch, and always with wonderful teachings. Rabbi Tuchman also leads mindfulness meditation for Neshev and for a couple of other Jewish organizations. And we're thrilled and glad that she's here to teach us today. Next week, we will study with Rabbi Evan Yakar of Lake Tahoe, California, Nevada. I'm not sure which side he's on. And we'll continue this discussion about finding hope in Jewish texts. Thank you, everyone. Have a Shabbat Shalom. Looking forward to seeing you again next week.